December 10th, 1979. A meatpacking warehouse on Flatlands Avenue, Brooklyn. The temperature inside the freezer hovered just above zero. A man named Chris Rosenberg stood over a butcher block, sleeves rolled up, a cigarette burning in an ashtray beside him. On the floor, wrapped in heavy plastic, was a body. Roy DeMeo watched from the doorway, arms crossed, eyes flat as nickels. The drain in the concrete had already been cleared. The bone saw was already plugged in. Within 90 minutes, the body would no longer exist. No fingerprints, no teeth, no torso. Just 6 neat packages destined for the Fountain Avenue dump in East New York. They called it the Gemini method. And by the time the FBI understood what was happening, Roy DeMeo's crew had erased somewhere between 70 and 200 human beings off the face of the earth. This wasn't just a hitman. Roy Albert DeMeo was a Gambino associate operating out of the Gemini Lounge at 4043 Flatlands Avenue, a man who turned murder into an assembly line so efficient that even John Gotti was afraid to walk into his back room. He laundered stolen cars through Kuwait, pornography through New Jersey, and corpses through a Brooklyn drain. He was, by every measure that matters, the most prolific killer in American organized crime history. This is the story of how Roy DeMeo learned the trick that made him a legend, how a Gambino butcher from Canarsie picked up a disposal method first perfected by Irish gangsters on the west side of Manhattan, how a culture of dismemberment crossed from the Westies of Hell's Kitchen into the Italian mob, and how 2 films, The Iceman and State of Grace, dramatized these 2 violent worlds without ever quite revealing the bridge between them. But here's what most true crime channels miss. The connection between Roy DeMeo and the Westies wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a business arrangement, sealed by Paul Castellano himself, that turned Hell's Kitchen and Canarsie into trading partners in the wholesale disposal of human beings. To understand how Roy DeMeo learned the method, you have to understand who Roy DeMeo was. Born in Brooklyn, 1942, the son of Italian immigrants, quiet kid, smart with numbers. By 15, he was running a paper route that doubled as a loan sharking operation, charging classmates 2 for 1 on lunch money. By the time he was 17, he was working under Anthony Gaggi, a made man in the Gambino family, soldier under Nino Gaggi's captain, James Failla. Roy idolized Gaggi, called him Uncle Nino, drove him to dinner, picked up his dry cleaning, and learned, slowly, that the way to rise in the Gambinos was not through fists. It was through earning and through usefulness. By 1972, Roy was running a loan sharking book worth roughly $500,000 on the street. He had a wife, Gladys, 3 kids, a split-level house in Massapequa Park, Long Island. He drove a Cadillac. He carried a .32 caliber pistol in an ankle holster. And he kept regular hours at the Gemini Lounge, a sleepy little bar on Flatlands Avenue that he co-owned with 2 brothers, Joseph and Anthony Guglielmo. Behind the bar was an apartment number 2. And inside that apartment was a small bathroom with a metal grate over the drain. That bathroom would become the most prolific kill room in American mob history. But before all that, before the Gemini method had a name, Roy was just a Brooklyn earner with a problem: bodies. You have to understand the rules of the game in the early 70s. When the Gambino family killed someone, the body was usually dumped. Trunk of a Buick at JFK, long-term parking, a vacant lot in Howard Beach. Sometimes Jamaica Bay. The problem was simple. Bodies talk. Forensics had been getting better since the 1968 federal wiretap statute, and the FBI was rolling out new investigative units focused specifically on La Cosa Nostra. A body in a trunk was a homicide investigation. A homicide investigation was pressure. Pressure was bad for business. Roy needed a better way. And the better way already existed. It existed about 10 miles northwest of the Gemini Lounge, on the west side of Manhattan, in a 30-block stretch of tenements and longshoreman bars known as Hell's Kitchen. run by a crew of Irish gangsters who would eventually be called the Westies. Now, the Westies. To understand the bridge between them and Roy DeMeo, you have to understand who they were. The Westies were the remnants of an older gang called the Hell's Kitchen Mob, run since the 1960s by a man named Mickey Spillane. Not the writer, the gangster. Spillane was old school. He gave turkeys at Christmas. He paid for kids' hospital bills. And he ran his neighborhood like a small-town mayor with a baseball bat. But by the mid-'70s, Spillane was getting pushed out by two new players, Jimmy Coonan and Mickey Featherstone. Jimmy Coonan was different. He had a college education, briefly. He read business books, and he had a single transformative idea that would change New York organized crime forever. He looked at his neighborhood, looked at the docks, looked at the meatpacking plants on 11th Avenue, looked at the freezers, looked at the bone saws sitting unused at 3 in the morning, and he had a thought: why bury a body when you can disappear it? Coonan's method was elegant, brutal, but elegant. The crew would lure a target to a Hell's Kitchen bar, usually the Skyline or the Westway Inn. They would shoot or stab the target in a back room with plastic sheeting laid down. Then they would do something nobody else in New York organized crime was doing systematically. They would bleed the body completely, dismember it in a bathtub or on a butcher's table, and pack the parts into garbage bags. The head and hands went separate. Sometimes the head went into a river upstate. Sometimes the hands were buried in New Jersey. The torso and limbs were thrown into the Hudson, into the Atlantic, into industrial dumpsters bound for landfills in Pennsylvania. The Westies had a saying for it: no body, no crime. And it worked. Between 1966 and 1978, the Westies are believed to have killed somewhere between 30 and 60 people. Almost none of them were ever found. Mickey Featherstone himself, after he flipped, would later testify that the crew became so casual about dismemberment that they would order Chinese food while working. Body parts on the table. Lo mein on the counter, just another Tuesday in Hell's Kitchen. Now, here is where the story gets interesting. Here is the moment that connects two worlds. By 1978, Jimmy Coonan had a bigger ambition. He didn't just want to run Hell's Kitchen. He wanted to be plugged in. He wanted official sanction. He wanted, in the language of the street, to become a partner of the Italians. So Coonan did something rare for an Irish gangster. He went to the Gambinos. Specifically, he went through Roy DeMeo's captain, the one and only Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino family, at his white-columned mansion on Todd Hill, Staten Island. The arrangement was simple. The Westies would become a labor pool for Italian contracts. They would handle hits the Italians wanted distanced from. In exchange, the Gambinos would protect them, supply work, and treat them as a recognized affiliate crew. Castellano agreed. The deal was sealed in a meeting at a restaurant in Manhattan, attended by Coonan, Featherstone, Castellano, and a handful of Gambino captains. And one of those captains, the man who handled the day-to-day liaison with the Westies for muscle and cleanup work, was Anthony Nino Gaggi, and Gaggi's right-hand man on this kind of business, Roy DeMeo. This is how Roy got close to the method. Not through rumor, not through legend, through direct contract work. Roy and his crew began coordinating with the Westies on shared problems: loan shark deadbeats, witnesses, the occasional Gambino soldier who had gone sideways. And in those coordination meetings, in those after-action conversations, in the natural way that professionals talk shop, the Westies described how they made bodies vanish. Now, did Jimmy Coonan personally walk Roy DeMeo through the dismemberment procedure step by step? Probably not. The accounts vary on this. What's documented through Mickey Featherstone's later cooperation testimony, through Gambino informant Dominic Montiglio, who was Nino Gaggi's nephew and Roy's frequent lieutenant, and through subsequent FBI debriefs, is that the two crews were aware of each other's methods. They shared targets. They shared techniques. They shared, in some cases, actual logistical resources. The Westies had access to meatpacking facilities. The DeMeo crew had access to a private apartment with a drain. By 1979, both crews were operating parallel disposal industries, and the cross-pollination was deliberate. Here's where it gets even more direct. According to Montilio's federal testimony, and corroborated in the book Murder Machine by Gene Mustaine and Jerry Capisi, Roy openly discussed the Westies with his crew. He admired their efficiency. He told his men that the Irish had figured out something the Italians had been slow to learn. That a body in pieces, packed in garbage bags, dropped at a Brooklyn dump scheduled for incineration, was a body that did not exist. And a body that did not exist did not generate a homicide file. Roy refined the method. He added his own touches. The bathtub at the Gemini was lined with plastic. The victim was shot in the head, usually with a .22 caliber pistol fitted with a silencer and a towel around the muzzle to catch the brass. The body was then moved to the bathroom, hung over the tub, and bled out for at least 20 minutes. The blood went down the drain. After the bleeding came the dismemberment. The head went separate. The hands went separate. The torso and limbs were sectioned at the joints with a butcher's knife and a bone saw. Each section was wrapped in paper, then plastic. Then the packages were loaded into garbage bags. Then the bags went into a trunk. Then the trunk went to the Fountain Avenue dump. The dump's manager was either bought or oblivious, most likely both. The DeMeo crew was performing this procedure, on average, once every 3 to 4 weeks at peak operation. Between 1975 and 1983, federal prosecutors would later attribute somewhere between 70 and 200 murders to Roy and his men. The crew included Chris Rosenberg, born Harvey Rosenberg, a Jewish kid from Canarsie who became Roy's de facto second-in-command. Anthony Center and Joseph Testa, two cousins from Brooklyn who looked like Hollywood extras, and Henry Borelli, a freelance hitman with a Marlboro habit and a deer-hunting background that made him steady with a knife. And here is where the cinema comes in, because two films, made in the same era, captured these worlds without ever quite naming the bridge. State of Grace, released 1990, directed by Phil Jones, starring Sean Penn, Ed Harris, and Gary Oldman, set in Hell's Kitchen, late 1970s. The film follows an undercover cop, played by Penn, who infiltrates an Irish crew run by his childhood friend Frankie Flannery, played by Harris. The crew is essentially the Westies in everything but name. The film captures the dismemberment culture, the meatpacking proximity, the cold professionalism, and the relationship between the Irish and the Italians. There is a famous scene where the Italians, played by figures including a chilling cameo by an Italian boss figure, sit down with Frankie and discuss bringing him into the larger family business. That scene mirrors, almost exactly, the real 1978 meeting between Coonan and Castellano. And then there is The Iceman, released 2012, directed by Ariel Vroman, starring Michael Shannon as Richard Kuklinski. Now here's the twist that confuses everyone, and you should understand it. The Iceman is about Richard Kuklinski, not Roy DeMeo. But Kuklinski worked for Roy. He was a contract killer who claimed, in his prison interviews with HBO and biographer Anthony Bruno, to have killed for the DeMeo crew. The Iceman shows Kuklinski's relationship with a Roy character played by Ray Liotta, named Roy DeMeo in the film. Liotta's portrayal captures something true about Roy. The combination of suburban husband and industrial murderer, the split-level house, the youth football coaching, the ability to leave a meeting where a body was being unwrapped, and drive home in time to read his daughter a bedtime story. Now here is what neither film fully shows. The Westies and Roy DeMeo were not separate stories. They were a single story, told from two ends of the same bridge. State of Grace shows you the Irish end. The Iceman shows you the Italian end. The bridge between them, the actual contractual relationship sealed at Castellano's mansion in 1978, is the missing third film that Hollywood has never made. To understand how deep the connection ran, consider this. When Roy needed to dispose of his own crew member, he used Gemini method procedures that the Westies had helped popularize. On May 11, 1979, Roy DeMeo personally murdered Chris Rosenberg, his closest associate, the man he had treated like a son. Chris had killed 2 Cuban drug dealers in a botched cocaine deal, and the Cubans had threatened to retaliate against Castellano himself. Big Paul ordered Roy to clean up the mess. Roy lured Chris to the Gemini lounge under the pretense of a meeting. Anthony Center shot him 3 times in the head. The body was processed in the back apartment. By midnight, Chris Rosenberg, age 28, no longer existed in any physical form recognizable as a human being. Roy reportedly cried that night. Then he went home, to Massapequa, to his wife and children, slept in his own bed, ate breakfast in the morning, drove back to the Gemini. That was Roy DeMeo. That was the contradiction that fascinated filmmakers and biographers for decades, a man who could love a kid like a son and butcher him in the same 8-hour shift. The end came for Roy in 1983. By then, the FBI had spent 5 years building a case. Agent Arthur Ruffles and a task force out of the Manhattan field office had been working informants, tapping phones, and documenting the chop shop operation that fed Roy's stolen car business. They had also been talking to a guy named Vito Arena. Vito was a hulking, gay, Gambino associate who knew everything about the DeMeo operation, and once arrested on an unrelated charge, he flipped. He gave the FBI the Gemini, the method, the kill room, and the names. Roy knew he was finished. The bosses knew it too. By the fall of 1983, Paul Castellano had become convinced that Roy was a liability. Too crazy. Too high profile. Too likely to be turned by federal agents who already had him on multiple murder counts and stolen vehicle racketeering. Castellano gave the order through Nino Gaggi. On January 10, 1983, Roy DeMeo, age 40, disappeared from his Long Island home. 8 days later, on January 18th, his body was found in the trunk of his own Cadillac, parked in the lot of the Varna Boat Club at the foot of Cropsey Avenue, Brooklyn. He had been shot multiple times in the head and the body. The Cadillac had been left there long enough that the engine block was frozen. The accounts vary on who actually pulled the trigger. Anthony Center and Joseph Testa, the cousins, are the most commonly named. Some say Nino Gaggi was present. Some say the killing happened in a basement in Brooklyn before the body was loaded into the trunk. What is certain? Roy DeMeo, the man who had perfected the disappearance of human beings, was the only one in his crew whose body was deliberately left to be found. A message from Castellano, the kind of mob kill that says, "We did this, and we want you to know." In the aftermath, Nino Gaggi went to federal prison and died there of a heart attack in 1988. Anthony Center and Joseph Testa were convicted in 1989 of multiple murders and received life sentences. They are still in federal custody. Henry Borelli received life plus. Dominic Montiglio cooperated and entered witness protection. The Westies fared no better. Jimmy Coonan was convicted at a 1988 RICO trial, largely on the testimony of Mickey Featherstone, his former partner. Coonan received 75 years. He died in federal prison in 2017. Featherstone, who had cooperated, lived out his days in witness protection. And Paul Castellano, the boss who blessed the bridge between the Westies and DeMeo, was shot dead outside Sparks Steakhouse at 210 East 46th Street, Manhattan, on December 16, 1985. John Gotti and Sammy Gravano organized the hit. Castellano died on the sidewalk in his cashmere overcoat, bleeding out next to his driver, Tommy Bellotti. The man who had authorized one of the most efficient murder pipelines in American history died exactly the way his victims should have died but never did, in public, with a body, with a homicide file. Here is what the Roy DeMeo and Westies story really reveals. Organized crime is a copying business. Methods are stolen the way recipes are stolen. The Italians did not invent body disposal. The Irish did not invent loan sharking. The crews learned from each other, traded with each other, and killed for each other. And the moment one crew figured out a more efficient way to erase a person, that knowledge spread across boroughs the way a virus spreads through a school. Roy DeMeo did not stumble onto the Gemini method by accident. He learned it the way every successful criminal learns, by watching people who were already doing it better. The Westies had the bone saws and the meatpacking knowledge. Roy had the apartment, the drain, and the ambition to industrialize it. Together, knowingly or not, they built the most prolific murder pipeline in 20th century American crime. And when Hollywood made The Iceman and State of Grace, it captured each crew separately, in isolation, as if they were two different mob universes. They were not. They were one universe, joined at the hip by a handshake at Castellano's mansion, and held together by the simple, terrible truth that murder is most successful when nobody can find what is left. That is the lesson Roy DeMeo learned. That is the lesson that made him the most prolific killer in mob history. And that is the lesson that, in the end, ensured that when Roy DeMeo himself was killed, he was left in a trunk where the world could see him, because the men who killed him understood something Roy had forgotten. Sometimes the message of a body is more powerful than the silence of a missing one. If you found this story fascinating, hit subscribe. We drop a new mob documentary every week. Drop a comment. Which mob figure should we cover next?